Pre-calc, we're back to the second part of lesson 5.3, and I'm going to just walk you through number 18, and then we'll just have a look at some different scenarios on what you might see with your answers. So if we solve this for sine squared, we're going to find that sine squared is 1/2. When we take the square root, we get plus or minus the square root of 1/2, and then we rationalize the denominator. All right, sine is positive radical 2 over 2 in the first and second quadrants. So that's going to be pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4. Sine is negative in the last two quadrants. How do these angles relate to each other? So if I start with my coordinate plane, pi over 4 is there, and you're going to find that these angles are 90 degrees away from each other. So that's pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4. So if I started at pi over 4, I could add 180 to get to that angle. They're 180 apart, but why not just add 90 to get to this one? Or add 90 again to get this one. So since these are 90 degrees apart, we're going to add pi over 2 times n to our first answer. So we're going to take pi over 4, and we're going to add pi over 2 times n. And that's how you represent all 4 of those answers and every angle coterminal to them. So for example, if n is 0, I get pi over 4. If I plug in a 1 for n, I would add pi over 4 to pi over 2, and I would get 3 pi over 4, and so on. So it is understood that n is any integer. All right, some what ifs. What if, let's say you solved an equation and you got the answers pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. So what would I do with that? Well, I'm going to graph them. There's pi over 2, there's 3 pi over 2. Then I'm going to ask myself, how far apart are they? They're 180 degrees apart. So I'm going to take pi over 2, which is the first one, and I'm going to add 180 degrees, which is pi n. That takes care of both of these answers. So what you want to do is you want to state the formula that I have here in pink as your final answer, because that takes in both of those answers that I circled in yellow. Likewise, if I had answers of 0 and pi. 0 sits here, pi sits there. How many degrees apart are they? Well, they're 180 degrees apart as well. So I'm going to start with 0, and I'm going to add n pi to that, or pi n. It doesn't matter which way you say that. So that's just pi n. Pi n takes care of both 0 and pi. And let's just rehash what happens when they're not 90 degrees apart or 180 apart. So for example, let's say that I had answers of 4 pi over 3 and 5 pi over 3. 4 pi over 3 would be here, and 5 pi over 3 would be here. Those angles are what? 60 degrees apart from each other. They're not 90 apart from each other. They're not 180 apart. So what you have to do when they're not 90 or 180 is you're going to have to add 2 pi to each. So let's just do a quick review here. On number 18, every angle that came up in my answer set to start with was 90 degrees apart from each other. So I just take the first one and I add on increments of 90 degrees. That's what I have here. In my two what if scenarios here, I show you that I have two answers that are both 180 apart. So in that case, I start with the first answer that I get on my unit circle and I add 180. On my last example, I went back through and said, okay, if I have two answers that aren't 90 degrees apart, they're not 180 apart, if neither of those situations are relevant, then I'm going to add 2 pi n to each answer. So I hope that summarizes what we've done. Let me know if you have any questions.